Your entire family because of some paranoid misunderstanding. I'm not disinheriting my entire family, Eleanor corrected. My grandchildren will still receive their educational trusts that will now be managed by independent trustees. With no family connections. What I am doing is protecting what remains of my estate from the people who have already stolen $2 million from it. Charlotte's composure finally broke. Mom, you're making a terrible mistake. These allegations are completely unfounded. If you proceed with this, you'll die alone. Is that what you want? To spend your final years isolated from everyone who loves you? Do you love me, Charlotte? Eleanor asked, her voice softer now. Or do you love what I represent, security, inheritance, the continuation of a lifestyle you haven't actually earned? Because love doesn't steal. Love doesn't conspire. Love doesn't create dementia narratives to seize control of someone's autonomy. The confrontation escalated as Michael attempted to dismiss the evidence as misunderstandings and Charlotte shifted between legal threats and emotional manipulation. Thomas remained largely silent, his financial expertise rendered useless in the face of such comprehensive documentation. Throughout it all, the recording device captured every word, every admission disguised as denial, every threat wrapped in concern for her welfare. Here's what happens next, Eleanor said finally, when their arguments had exhausted themselves. You have two choices. Option 1, you sign legal documents admitting to the unauthorized transfers, agree to full restitution of the diverted funds, and accept the terms of my revised estate plan without challenge. In return, I don't pursue criminal charges for elder financial abuse and fraud. And option 2? Michael asked, his lawyer's mind already calculating risks and benefits. I release the evidence to the Washington State Attorney General's Elder Fraud Division, to the Seattle Times, and to the Bar Association Ethics Committee. You lose your law license, Michael. Charlotte, you face disbarment as well. Thomas, your investment firm faces regulatory investigation. And all of you face potential criminal charges. The shock on their faces confirmed what Eleanor had suspected. They had never imagined she would fight back with such calculated precision. They had underestimated her, dismissing her as a confused old woman past her prime, incapable of recognizing their manipulation, let alone countering it with her own strategic response. You're bluffing, Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Eleanor removed her phone from her pocket and played a brief segment of his earlier conversation about the Cayman transfer and the dementia narrative. The blood drained from his face. You've been recording us? That's illegal without consent in Washington state. Actually, Eleanor replied, Washington is a one-party consent state for recordings. As long as one participant in the conversation consents, in this case, me, the recording is perfectly legal. I may be old, Michael, but unlike you, I actually researched the relevant laws before acting. The confrontation lasted another hour, cycling through denial, anger, bargaining, and finally a grim acceptance that Eleanor had outmaneuvered them. She presented the legal documents she had prepared with the help of a new attorney in Seattle, one with no connections to James Harrington or the Blackwood family. By midnight, all three had signed agreements acknowledging the unauthorized transfers, committing to full restitution within 90 days, and accepting the terms of Eleanor's revised estate plan. The documents included confidentiality clauses that would protect the family from public scandal, but also severe financial penalties if they challenged her competency or the validity of the agreements. As they prepared to leave the study, Charlotte paused at the door. Was any of it real, Mom? Did you ever actually care about us, or were we just obligations to you? The question cut deeper than any accusation. Eleanor looked at her daughter, the child she had raised, the woman she had admired, the stranger who had betrayed her, and felt the full weight of their mutual failure. I have loved you every day of your life, Charlotte. That love is why this betrayal hurts so deeply. That love is why I'm giving you a chance to make amends rather than pressing criminal charges. But love without accountability isn't love at all, it's complicity. After they left, Eleanor remained in the study, listening to the sounds of the family gathering continuing in her home as if nothing had happened. Holiday music still played. Children still laughed. Relatives still exchanged pleasantries and compliments about her hospitality. But something fundamental had shifted, like a geological fault line beneath a seemingly stable landscape. The facade of family harmony had cracked, revealing the corrupt foundation beneath. The only question was whether that foundation could be rebuilt or whether the entire structure needed to be abandoned. Eleanor removed the recording device from its hiding place and added it to the others she had collected throughout the evening. Together, they contained irrefutable evidence of both the financial exploitation and her relatives' calculated attempts to have her declared incompetent for their benefit. She would keep these recordings secure, not as weapons, but as insurance against future manipulation. The legal documents her family had signed would protect her financially, but only vigilance would protect her autonomy. As midnight approached, Eleanor stood on her porch watching the last of her relatives depart. Snow had begun falling again, coating the landscape in pristine white that belied the ugliness that had been exposed beneath her roof. Charlotte hesitated by her car, looking back at the mother she had betrayed. For a moment, something like regret crossed her face, not for the betrayal itself, perhaps, but for its discovery and consequences. Eleanor raised her hand in a gesture that was neither forgiveness nor farewell, but rather acknowledgement of a painful truth: some bonds, once broken, could never be fully restored. As the last taillights disappeared down her snowy driveway, Eleanor Blackwood returned to her empty house. The caterers had finished their cleanup. The holiday decorations still twinkled. To a casual observer, nothing would indicate that one of the most significant confrontations of her life had just occurred within these walls. She made herself a cup of tea, William's favorite Earl Grey, and settled into his armchair beside the Christmas tree. The weight of the evening pressed down on her, not with the anxiety that had preceded it, but with a curious mixture of grief and liberation. She had protected her legacy. She had demanded accountability. She had refused to be a passive victim of exploitation by those she had trusted most. But the victory felt hollow in the silence of her Victorian home. She had won the battle for her autonomy and her estate, but lost the illusion of family that had sustained her since William's death. "Is this what you meant about integrity, William?" she whispered to the empty room. "That sometimes keeping it costs everything else?" The grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking the end of a day that had forever altered the course of her remaining years. Eleanor Blackwood, 71 years old, widowed, and now estranged from the family who had betrayed her, sat alone on Christmas night contemplating the difference between solitude and loneliness. She had chosen truth over comfortable lies, accountability over enabling, principle over peace. Whether those choices would ultimately lead to healing or deeper estrangement remained to be seen. But for the first time in months, she felt the clear-eyed certainty that had defined her academic career. She had faced a moral crucible and emerged with her integrity intact, even as her heart remained broken by the choices that had forced her into that crucible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: establishing the William Blackwood Foundation, restructuring her estate with trustworthy advisors, rebuilding a life outside the family connections that had defined her identity for decades. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of confrontation, Eleanor Blackwood allowed herself to acknowledge both the necessity and the cost of standing one's ground against betrayal, even when that betrayal came from those you had loved most in the world. The Seattle winter light filtered through Eleanor's bay windows, casting long shadows across her dining room table where legal documents now replaced family photographs. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation at the family reunion, and the Victorian house on Whidbey Island had transformed from a family gathering place to the command center for Eleanor's reclamation of her legacy. Amelia Chen, the new attorney Eleanor had retained, spread another set of documents across the antique mahogany. At 42, Amelia specialized in elder law and financial abuse cases, her reputation built on an unwavering commitment to protecting vulnerable clients from predatory family members and institutions. "The William Blackwood Foundation paperwork is complete," Amelia said, tapping a blue folder. 501(c)(3) status is pending, but with your academic credentials and the Foundation's educational focus, approval should be straightforward. "I've established the independent board of trustees as you requested, educators and librarians with impeccable reputations and no connection to your family." Eleanor nodded, feeling a bittersweet satisfaction. Meal unfolded in the grand dining room, 24 Blackwood family members seated around the antique mahogany table that had witnessed 4 decades of gatherings. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier, reflecting prisms across faces that Eleanor now saw with painful clarity, not as the loving family she had believed in, but as accomplices in a systematic betrayal. She sat at the head of the table, as tradition dictated, surveying her domain like a queen who had discovered treason in her court. The recorder hidden in the centerpiece captured every conversation, every casual reference to purchases and investments. That should have been beyond her relatives' means. Charlotte raised her glass as the main course was served. "I'd like to propose a toast to Mom, who brings us together year after year in this beautiful home. To many more holidays with the woman who has given us so much." "To Aunt Ellie," echoed. Around the table, glasses raised in a performance of gratitude that turned Eleanor's stomach. "Thank you all for coming," she responded, standing with her own glass raised. "Family has always been my highest priority. Everything I've built, everything I've saved, has been with you in mind. My legacy is not just financial but ethical. The choices we make, the values we demonstrate, the integrity we either uphold or compromise, these are the true inheritance I hope to leave behind. A sudden stillness fell across the table. Her words, though carefully chosen to appear innocuous, carried an undercurrent that made several family members shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Well said, Mom, Charlotte offered, her smile tight. To family values. As the meal continued, Eleanor excused herself briefly, ostensibly to check on dessert. Instead, she slipped into the study where Michael had spent nearly 30 minutes earlier in the day. The recording device was exactly where she had hidden it, beneath a stack of financial magazines on the side table. She pressed play, using earbuds to listen privately. Michael's voice emerged with startling clarity. James, it's Michael. We need to accelerate the Cayman transfer. Aunt Ellie is asking questions about the scholarship disbursements. No. She doesn't have concrete evidence, but she's not as oblivious as we thought. Charlotte's worried she's documenting discrepancies. Yes, I understand the risks, but if we wait until after New Year's, we might lose the opportunity altogether. The dementia narrative is our insurance policy. Thomas has already spoken with Dr. Linden about cognitive assessment. Just make it happen. Eleanor's hands trembled as she stopped the recording and returned the device to its hiding place. The confirmation of her suspicions brought no satisfaction, only a bone-deep sorrow that physical pain couldn't match. The dementia narrative explained Charlotte's recent concerns, the casual mentions of forgetfulness, the suggested doctor's appointments. They weren't just stealing her money. They were preparing to steal her autonomy. She rejoined the gathering. With a composure born from decades of academic discipline, serving Christmas pudding with steady hands while her mind processed the magnitude of the betrayal. The conversation around the table had shifted to summer vacation plans, Thomas detailing the Mediterranean cruise they'd booked, Richard describing the month-long tour of Southeast Asia he and Margaret were planning. Vacations that Eleanor's diverted funds were undoubtedly financing. Those sound like wonderful adventures, she commented, serving Margaret a generous portion of pudding. I've been considering some travels myself in the coming year. Perhaps I'll finally write that book on early American women's literature I've been contemplating. Oh, Mom, Charlotte interjected quickly, exchanging glances with Thomas. Travel can be so exhausting at your age. And starting a major writing project might be overwhelming. Why not enjoy your retirement here, where we can all look after you? Look after me, Eleanor repeated, allowing a hint of steel to enter her voice. How interesting that you think I need looking after, Charlotte. I managed a full professorship while raising you and caring for your father during his illness. I've maintained this house and my investments quite successfully for 4 years since William's death. What exactly about my behavior suggests I need supervision? An uncomfortable silence fell across the table. Michael cleared his throat. Aunt Ellie, Charlotte is just concerned about you. We all are. The isolation out here on the island, the late nights, the fixation on financial details that are being well managed by professionals like you, Michael. Eleanor asked quietly. Yes, he replied, confidence returning. By professionals who understand the complexities of modern estate management better than someone from an academic background. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. I've always valued education, both formal and self-directed. In fact, I've been educating myself quite extensively recently on topics like trustee malfeasance, elder financial exploitation, and the legal consequences of fiduciary breach. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the children, absorbed in their electronic devices at the far end of the table, seemed to sense the sudden tension. Perhaps, Eleanor continued, her voice steady, we should continue this conversation after dessert. Michael, Charlotte, Thomas, would you join me in the study in 20 minutes? I have some documents I'd like to discuss with you. The trap was set. The primary recording device waited in the study, positioned to capture what she suspected would be the most damning conversations of the evening. As the family dispersed after dessert, Eleanor stationed herself in the kitchen, ostensibly to supervise the caterer's cleanup. In reality, she was preparing for the confrontation that would either reclaim her legacy or confirm that it was irretrievably lost. Charlotte entered first, her legal training evident in her composed expression. Thomas followed, then Michael, closing the door behind them with a decisive click that seemed to signal the beginning of the final act. Mom, Charlotte began, sitting across from Eleanor at the antique desk that had belonged to William. We're worried about you. These accusations you're implying, these suspicions about financial impropriety, they're symptoms of something concerning. What my wife is trying to say, Thomas interjected, is that paranoia about finances is often an early indicator of cognitive decline. It's actually quite common in elderly individuals with your educational background. The analytical mind becomes fixated on perceived patterns that don't actually exist. Eleanor studied them, these people she had loved and nurtured, now united in their attempt to gaslight her into doubting her own perceptions. How convenient, she said finally, that my concerns about missing funds align so perfectly with symptoms of dementia. Tell me, Thomas, did Dr. Linden suggest this diagnosis before or after you discussed having me declared incompetent? The shock on their faces confirmed what the recording had revealed. They hadn't expected her to know about their discussions with her physician. That's absurd, Michael interjected. No one is trying to have you declared incompetent. We're concerned about your well-being. My well-being, Eleanor repeated. And does my well-being include the unauthorized transfer of $2 million from my trusts to offshore accounts? Does it include the systematic liquidation of investments earmarked for my grandchildren's education? Does it include the deliberate manipulation of my estate to enrich yourselves while I'm still alive to witness it? She opened her desk drawer and removed a folder containing the documented evidence she had compiled over the previous weeks. These are copies, she said, pushing the folder toward Charlotte. The originals, along with recorded evidence of your conversations about accelerating transfers and creating a dementia narrative, are in secure locations. Locations that neither you nor James Harrington can access. Charlotte's legal training took over as she paged through the documents, her face paling with each spreadsheet and bank statement. Mom, these transfers were authorized investment vehicles designed to stop lying, Charlotte, Eleanor interrupted, her voice uncharacteristically harsh. I taught critical analysis for 40 years. I can recognize a manufactured narrative when I hear one. The only question remaining is what happens next. Michael leaned forward, his expression shifting from shock to calculation. Aunt Ellie, regardless of how these documents appear, challenging us legally would be devastating for the family. The publicity, the legal costs, the damage to everyone's reputation, surely you don't want that for Charlotte's children or for your own legacy. My legacy, Eleanor said quietly. How interesting that you mention that, Michael. Because my legacy is precisely what we're here to discuss. She removed another document from her desk, a revised will dated the previous week. This document removes all three of you as beneficiaries of my estate. It redirects all assets to the William Blackwood Foundation, a newly established nonprofit that will manage my estate for its original intended purposes, educational scholarships, historical preservation, and support for causes that William and I valued. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, marking the seconds of a confrontation decades in the making. You can't do this, Thomas said finally. You can't just disinherit. In the snow-dusted hills of Seattle, Washington, a 71-year-old retired literature professor was about to orchestrate the most calculated disappearing act of her life. What began as a routine family reunion spiraled into a devastating revelation. When she discovered her relatives were systematically exploiting her $4.7 million estate. Eleanor Blackwood wasn't your typical grandmother. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. For over 40 years, she had meticulously built her legacy through shrewd investments and unwavering discipline. When she uncovered her family's betrayal, she had no idea she was walking into a generational conspiracy. Eleanor staged a brilliant vanishing act that her relatives laughed off, never knowing. She was secretly recording every cruel word. The December wind whistled through the cedar trees surrounding Eleanor Blackwood's Victorian home on Whidbey Island. Snow drifted lazily past the floor-to-ceiling windows, accumulating on the deck that overlooked Puget Sound. The house, built in 1897 and lovingly restored by Eleanor and her late husband William, stood as a testament to her appreciation for history and attention to detail. Eleanor adjusted her reading glasses and squinted at her laptop screen, the blue light making her tired eyes water as she reviewed her financial portfolio. 43 years she'd walked the halls of the University of Washington as a professor of American literature, and still her home felt different during the holidays, too empty, too quiet, like a theater after the audience had departed. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, organizing the documents for her annual portfolio review that should have been completed weeks ago. At 71, Eleanor had developed a rhythm to her retirement that younger family members couldn't understand. Methodical, precise, unshakable. She'd outlasted 3 financial advisors and countless market fluctuations by being exactly what modern America claimed to value but rarely respected, prudent and patient. The trust fund distribution reports had been troubling her for months. Numbers that refused to align. Withdrawals that appeared and disappeared like ghosts in the ledgers. William would have told her she was overthinking it. Her late husband had always said her analytical mind was both her greatest strength and her most demanding companion. Sometimes, Ellie, his voice echoed in her memory, a clerical error is just a clerical error. But these weren't errors. Eleanor leaned back. In her leather chair, the kind she'd splurged on after her back surgery 3 years ago. The document on her screen showed a trust withdrawal of $175,000 to an account she'd never authorized. The transaction bore her nephew Michael's digital signature, but the account number led nowhere in her financial institution's system. At least, nowhere she had access to. Her heart began to beat faster. That steady rhythm she remembered from her wedding day, from Charlotte's birth, from the moment the doctor had told her William wouldn't survive the stroke. Recognition without understanding, like seeing storm clouds gather on a clear day. She opened another file, then another. The pattern emerged with the cold clarity of mathematics. Systematic withdrawals, always cleverly disguised as investment vehicles, always to accounts that existed in bureaucratic limbo. Hundreds of thousands of dollars vanishing like morning fog over the Sound. Good God, she whispered, then immediately glanced around the empty study. Even alone, she felt exposed. William's voice again, when you find yourself outmaneuvered. Ellie, first thing you do is assess your position. But she couldn't stop. Her scholar's mind demanded answers, craved the satisfaction of logical explanations for discrepancies. She pulled file after file, cross-referencing account numbers, tracking the electronic breadcrumbs that led deeper into her family's digital deception. The printer in the corner hummed to life, breaking the silence like a gunshot. Eleanor's hands shook as she gathered the documents. Each page revealed another layer of the scheme. Trust funds. Money that belonged to her grandchildren's education, to the Historical Preservation Society, to the university scholarship that carried William's name. Her phone buzzed. A text from Charlotte in Portland. Mom, you're working too late again. The lights from your study are reflecting on the snow. It's nearly midnight. Rest. Eleanor stared at the message, struck by the irony. Her daughter, living in another state, could track her location by the glow of her desk lamp, but no one in her family seemed to notice that hundreds of thousands of dollars were walking out the door. Or maybe they did notice. Maybe that was worse. She began photographing the documents with her phone, hands trembling so badly she had to brace her elbows on the desk. Each camera click felt like a small betrayal. Not of her family, but of the person she'd been for 43 years. The trusting matriarch, the generous benefactor, the woman who believed family bonds transcended base financial concerns. The doorbell chimed in the distance, its melodic tones echoing through the empty house. Eleanor's blood froze. No one visited Whidbey Island unannounced in December, especially not at midnight during a snowfall. She quickly shuffled the papers back into their folders, her heart hammering against her ribs. Footsteps crunched in the snow outside, the measured pace of someone who belonged here. Eleanor forced herself to close the laptop, fingers moving. To hide the evidence while her mind raced. She moved toward the front door with deliberate calm, peering through the sidelight. Michael stood on her porch, snowflakes settling on his expensive camel hair coat. Her nephew, her late brother's only son, whom she'd put through law school. The executor of her estate. The man whose signature appeared on unauthorized transfers. Aunt Ellie, he called through the door, his breath fogging in the cold. I was driving back from a client meeting in Coupeville and saw your lights. Everything okay? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A client meeting at midnight? On Whidbey Island during a snowstorm? The lie was so transparent it almost made her laugh. He'd been alerted somehow. Perhaps by Charlotte's innocent text about her late-night work session. Or perhaps by monitoring software on her financial accounts. Michael, she said, opening the door just enough to speak but not enough to invite him in. What a surprise. I'm fine, just catching up on some reading. His eyes, so much like her brother's, assessed her carefully. You look tired, Aunt Ellie. Have you been sleeping properly? Charlotte mentioned you've been acting differently lately. The concern in his voice sounded genuine, but Eleanor had taught Shakespeare for 4 decades. She recognized expert performers. Just the usual winter insomnia, she replied. Nothing to worry about. Well, since I'm here, maybe I could look at those portfolio questions you mentioned last month? Better than emailing documents back and forth. So that was it. He wanted to see what she'd discovered. Not tonight, Michael. I'm heading to bed soon. We can discuss it at the family reunion next week. Something flickered behind his eyes, calculation, perhaps, or frustration. Of course. Get some rest, Aunt Ellie. We all worry about you living out here alone, you know. After he left, Eleanor stood in her foyer, listening to the crunch of his departing footsteps, the soft purr of his luxury sedan pulling away from her home. The house suddenly felt different, no longer a sanctuary but a stage where she was being watched. At home in her Victorian house on Whidbey Island, Eleanor spread the photographs across her kitchen table like pieces of a mosaic revealing an ugly truth. The familiar space, William's coffee mug still in its place by the espresso machine, the hand-knotted Persian rug they'd purchased on their 30th anniversary trip, seemed to mock her with its normalcy. How could the world look exactly the same when everything had changed? She made copies using the color printer William had insisted they needed for archiving family photographs. Then locked the originals in the fireproof safe where they kept birth certificates and property deeds. Documents that mattered, documents that proved you existed, that your life had meaning. These documents proved something else entirely. Sleep eluded her that night. She lay in the bed she'd shared with William for 46 years, staring at ceiling shadows and calculating damage. If her estimates were correct, her nephew Michael and at least 2 other family members had diverted over $1.2 million from her estate in the past 4 years. $1.2 million that was meant to fund university scholarships, support the Historical Society, and provide security for her grandchildren. Morning came with the mechanical cheerfulness of her automatic coffee maker and the weight of decision pressing down like Washington rain. Eleanor dressed with unusual care. Her charcoal wool suit, the one William had said made her look like she could command a boardroom. Maybe she couldn't command it, but she could damn sure protect it from predators, even if those predators shared her DNA. James Harrington's law office occupied the penthouse floor of a Seattle high-rise. All glass and steel and intimidating. Views of Puget Sound and the Olympic Mountains beyond. Her family's attorney for 25 years was younger than Charlotte, with the kind of aggressive confidence that made Eleanor feel simultaneously impressed and invisible. Mrs. Blackwood, James's smile was professional but cool. This is highly irregular. If you have concerns about your trust management, there are proper channels. I've been your client for 25 years, Eleanor interrupted, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. I know about proper channels. I also know about proper fiduciary responsibility, and what I found isn't proper anything. She slid copies of the documents across James's pristine desk, watching as the lawyer's expression shifted from dismissive to calculating. James's fingers moved across the pages with surgical precision, his face revealing nothing. Mrs. Blackwood, James finally said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone usually reserved for confused elderly relatives. These are complex financial instruments, investment vehicles designed to maximize returns for your beneficiaries. I understand they might appear irregular to someone without expertise in modern estate planning, but I assure you, I've been managing my own investments since before you passed the bar, Eleanor said quietly. Don't mistake my age for incompetence. James's smile hardened. Of course not. But I think you'll find that these transactions are perfectly legal and have been approved by all relevant parties. Perhaps if you discussed your concerns with Michael authorized these transfers personally. Then I fail to see the problem. James gathered the papers and handed them back across the desk. Your nephew is the executor of your estate. He has both the authority and the responsibility to make investment decisions on your behalf. Eleanor stared at the documents in her hands, feeling like a student who'd brought research to a professor only to have it dismissed as amateur work. $1.2 million, James. $1.2 million that isn't where it's supposed to be. Mrs. Blackwood, James stood, signaling the end of the meeting. I appreciate your diligence, but I think it would be best if you focused on enjoying your retirement. And left the financial details to those of us trained to manage them. The elevator ride down felt like falling. Eleanor clutched the documents against her chest, watching the floor numbers descend, while her faith in the system she'd trusted for decades crumbled like weathered stone. By the time she reached the parking garage, she understood with crystalline clarity that she was alone with her knowledge. But she wasn't powerless. Not yet. That evening, she sat in William's old leather armchair with her laptop balanced on her knees, researching elder financial abuse and estate fraud. The internet was a foreign country to her, but necessity made her a quick student. She learned about trustee malfeasance and fiduciary duty, about family financial exploitation and the legal remedies available. She also learned how often the victims lost. Family members were given the benefit of the doubt. Elderly complainants were assumed to be confused or paranoid. The very systems designed to protect the vulnerable often reinforced their exploitation. Still, William's voice whispered in her memory, clear as the day he'd spoken the words during their last conversation before the stroke took him. Integrity, Ellie. That's all we really leave behind. Everything else is just possessions. The documents lay spread across the coffee table. Proof of a betrayal that seemed to grow larger every time she looked at it. $1.2 million diverted from people and causes she'd spent a lifetime preparing to support. Money that represented not just financial security but her values, her legacy, her final statement about what mattered. Eleanor Blackwood, 71 years old, widowed, dismissed by a lawyer young enough to be her son, stared at the evidence of betrayal and made her choice. She was going to need irrefutable proof. Evidence so clear and damning that even James Harrington couldn't wave it away with legal jargon, evidence that would force her family to confront their betrayal. The annual Blackwood family reunion was scheduled for the following week at her Whidbey Island home. It had been a tradition for 30 years, bringing together the scattered branches of the family tree from across the Pacific Northwest. This year, 23 relatives would gather under her roof, eat her food, exchange gifts, and, if her suspicions were correct, discuss how to further pillage her estate while smiling to her face. It was the perfect opportunity to gather evidence and to deliver consequences they would never forget. She opened her laptop and began a new document titled Revised Estate Plans. The words flowed with surprising ease, as if she'd been preparing this document her entire life. Perhaps, in a way, she had been. Every betrayal, every disappointment, every moment when she'd chosen forbearance over confrontation had led her to this moment of clarity. The irrefutable evidence she needed lay just beyond her reach, locked behind family loyalty and legal maneuvering. Eleanor stared at her laptop screen in the pre-dawn darkness of her kitchen, the cursor blinking against the white background like a metronome marking time she no longer had to waste. William's coffee mug sat cold beside her, forgotten in the 5 hours she'd spent researching recording laws in Washington state, family trust regulations, and the psychological patterns of financial predators. The family photographs that lined her hallway spread before her like a prosecutor's evidence board. Michael at his law school graduation, beaming as she handed him the gold watch that had belonged to his father. Charlotte and her husband Thomas at their wedding, where Eleanor had gifted them the down payment for their Portland home. Her 3 grandchildren at various ages, for whom she'd established educational trusts that were now being systematically drained. Her hands shook as she traced the connections and calculated motivations. The family reunion would bring all the players together: Michael, the executor who authorized the fraudulent transfers; Charlotte, whose signature appeared on several suspicious documents; Thomas, whose investment firm mysteriously managed accounts receiving the diverted funds. Even her sister-in-law Margaret, whose recent extravagant lifestyle belied her modest teacher's pension. Eleanor pulled up the voice recording app on her phone, testing its range and clarity. William's voice on an old voicemail came through with startling fidelity: "Ellie, don't forget to pick up the dry cleaning before the symphony tonight. Love you." But would the app capture conversations across a crowded dining room, through the noise of a family gathering, through her own emotional haze if her plan went wrong? Because it would go wrong. She knew that with the certainty of someone who'd spent decades analyzing narrative structures and character motivations. A controlled confrontation with family betrayers was a contradiction in terms, like controlled chaos or predictable surprise. Human emotions didn't follow literary conventions. She opened William's old desk drawer and removed the small digital recorder he'd used for dictating lecture notes. The device was ancient by modern standards, but it had 2 advantages her phone lacked: a 48-hour battery life and the ability to record while appearing completely powered down. She tested it, speaking in whispers that the sensitive microphone captured with startling clarity. "This is Eleanor Blackwood," she said to the empty kitchen. "If you're hearing this recording, it means I've either been declared incompetent, institutionalized, or worse." The words hung in the air like an epitaph. She deleted the file and started over. At 7 a.m., her phone buzzed with Charlotte's daily check-in call from Portland. Eleanor let it ring 3 times before answering, using the delay to arrange her voice into something resembling normalcy. "Morning, darling," she said, surprised by how steady she sounded. "Mom, you sound tired. Were you up all night again?" Charlotte's voice carried that note of controlled concern that had become increasingly common in their conversations. "Mrs. Abernathy said she saw your lights on at 4 a.m. Judith Abernathy, bless her heart, had appointed herself the neighborhood watch coordinator for Eleanor's well-being. The retired nurse next door meant well, but her vigilance had become another obstacle to navigate. Just couldn't sleep," Eleanor said, which was true enough. "You know how it is when your mind gets going." "That's exactly what I'm worried about." Charlotte's attorney voice emerged, crisp and logical. "Mom, you've been acting different lately. Erratic. Staying up all night, asking strange questions. About your investments, that weird conversation last week about family loyalty and what constitutes betrayal. Are you having some kind of delayed grief response?" "I'm 71, Charlotte. If I'm having a delayed response to anything, it's to the realization that time isn't infinite." "This isn't funny." The sharpness in Charlotte's voice cut through the phone like thin ice breaking. "I've been researching cognitive decline and behavioral changes in older adults. The paranoia, the sleep disturbances. I'm not paranoid, Eleanor interrupted, perhaps too forcefully. I'm just thinking about my legacy differently since your father died. The silence stretched between them. 2 states and 4 years of grief, creating a chasm that neither woman seemed able to bridge. William had been their translator, the buffer who helped them understand each other's different languages of love and concern. Mom, Charlotte said finally, her voice softer. I think you should talk to someone. A therapist maybe, or Dr. Linden. These middle-of-the-night sessions, this sudden obsession with your finances, it's not healthy. I'll think about it, Eleanor lied, already knowing she wouldn't have the luxury of keeping that promise if her plan succeeded or failed. After Charlotte hung up, Eleanor sat in William's chair and wrote the letter she hoped no one would ever have to read. Her handwriting, usually as elegant as her prose, wandered across the page as emotion overrode muscle memory. If something happens to me after the family reunion, it wasn't natural causes. The documents in the safe contain evidence of systematic financial exploitation totaling over $1.2 million. I tried to report it through proper channels, but James Harrington dismissed my concerns. Michael is directly involved, and I suspect Charlotte and Thomas as well. Charlotte, I know you'll be angry that I didn't confront you directly. I know you'll convince yourself you were acting in my best interest. But this isn't about you, darling. This is about the difference between what we say we value and what our actions prove we actually do. Your father always said integrity was all we really have in the end. I finally understand what he meant. I love you. I'm proud of the woman you've become, and I hope someday you'll understand why I had to do this. She sealed the letter in an envelope marked, for Charlotte, open only if necessary, and placed it in the safe beside the copied documents. The afternoon brought practical considerations that felt surreal in their mundanity. What clothes would best conceal recording equipment? During a family reunion? Her usual holiday attire of festive sweaters felt too informal for what might become the most important performance of her life. She settled on a series of elegant tunics with deep pockets. Clothes that would blend into the grandmother stereotype while serving her desperate purpose. She practiced placing the recorders strategically throughout the house. One in the dining room where the main discussions would occur. One in the study where Michael always conducted private family business. One in her bedroom in case they decided to confront her personally. And one on her person at all times, the ultimate backup if all other evidence disappeared. The acoustics of her Victorian home haunted her calculations. 40 years of hosting gatherings had taught her how sound traveled through its spaces. Conversations in the dining room echoed slightly in the foyer. Discussions in the study carried through the heating vents to the second floor. If she positioned everything correctly, if she timed everything perfectly, she might capture enough to matter. But timing was everything, and everything was beyond her control. At sunset, she drove into town, studying the Christmas decorations. And smiling faces with the intensity of someone memorizing a scene she might never witness again. The holiday lights on Coupeville's historic buildings sparkled against the early evening darkness, reminding her of Christmases past when family had meant security rather than threat. She parked outside Judith's house and walked the familiar path to her front door. Muscle memory guiding her while her mind rehearsed scenarios. Each step felt weighted with finality, as if she were walking toward a confrontation she'd postponed for too long. Inside, she made William's favorite dinner. Salmon with dill sauce, wild rice, and roasted Brussels sprouts, comfort food that tasted like ashes in her mouth. She ate mechanically, fueling her body for what might be its final performance as the Blackwood family matriarch. At 11 p.m., she set 3 alarms and lay down fully clothed, the recording device still in her pocket like a talisman. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of confrontation, and William's voice asking why she couldn't just let it go. Because some legacies were worth fighting for. Some truths were worth the price of everything. The alarm at 5 a.m. sounded like a starting gun. Eleanor rose in the darkness, moving through her morning routine with ritualistic precision. Coffee, shower, the careful application of makeup that might need to disguise emotions later in the day. The digital recorders checked one final time and positioned throughout the house for maximum coverage. She looked at herself in William's shaving mirror, seeing a woman who'd spent 71 years building a life based on principles that had just been revealed as naive. The face looking back was older than she remembered, marked by recent sleepless nights and the weight of terrible knowledge. But her eyes held something new, a determination that surprised her with its strength. Today, she would either reclaim her legacy or watch it disappear completely. Either way, she would no longer be a passive participant in her own exploitation. The preparations for the family reunion felt like arming for battle. Setting out the good china that had belonged to her grandmother. Arranging flowers from her winter garden. Reviewing the catering order for the 23 guests who would arrive by noon. 23 relatives who had no idea that this year's family gathering would be unlike any that had come before. That this year, the grandmother they had systematically betrayed was prepared to disappear from their lives as completely as they had disappeared her fortune. Eleanor's Victorian home buzzed with activity by 11 a.m. as caterers arranged holiday platters in the dining room. Through the bay windows, she watched vehicles navigating the snowy driveway, luxury SUVs and German sedans forming a procession of wealth that she had unknowingly financed. Each arrival brought a fresh wave of anxiety as she mentally reviewed the locations of her recording devices. The digital recorder sat heavy in the pocket of her burgundy tunic, pressing against her hip like a secret weapon. She touched it briefly for reassurance, then smoothed her silver hair and prepared to greet the first arrivals with the warm smile they expected from the family matriarch. Aunt Ellie. Michael's voice boomed through the foyer as he entered, bringing a gust of cold air and the scent of expensive cologne. He embraced her with practiced affection, his wife Veronica following with their teenage twins. The house looks spectacular, as always. We've been so looking forward to this, Veronica added, handing Eleanor a bottle of champagne that cost more than most people earned in a day. The children wouldn't stop talking about Grandma Ellie's Christmas cookies. Eleanor accepted their performances with one of her own, a convincing portrayal of the doting aunt and grandmother who suspected nothing. The cookie decorating station is all set up in the sunroom. And Michael, there's a package that arrived for you in the study. Something from your investment broker, I believe. The bait was set. The first recording device waited in the study, already activated. Within the hour, all 23 family members had arrived. Charlotte and Thomas with their 3 children, Eleanor's brother-in-law Richard and his new wife, cousins from Spokane and Bellingham. Even distant relatives who rarely made appearances at family functions but had suddenly shown renewed interest in reconnecting with the wealthy widow. The Victorian house filled with conversation and laughter, holiday music playing softly through the speaker system that William had installed before his death. To casual observation, it was the perfect family gathering, for generations sharing memories and creating new ones beneath twinkling lights and garlands of fresh cedar. But Eleanor moved through her home like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture, noting the subtle exchanges between Michael and Thomas, the way Charlotte avoided direct eye contact, the conspicuous display of wealth from relatives whose financial situations shouldn't have allowed such extravagance. Ellie, these appetizers are divine, her sister-in-law Margaret gushed, gesturing with a glass of Chardonnay that never seemed to empty. You always did know how to throw the most elegant parties. Thank you, Margaret, Eleanor replied, noticing the new diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. I believe in investing in quality experiences. Speaking of investments, that's a lovely bracelet. Is it new? Margaret's hand went instinctively to her wrist. Oh, this old thing? Richard gave it to me for our anniversary. Nothing special. The tennis bracelet was worth at least $15,000, a remarkable gift from a retired high school principal to a former elementary school teacher. Unless, of course, it had been purchased with diverted trust funds. How thoughtful of him, Eleanor said, smiling with a warmth that didn't reach her eyes. Families should always take care of each other, shouldn't they? The first phase of her plan unfolded naturally as the afternoon progressed. Eleanor moved from conversation to conversation, dropping subtle references to her financial concerns, watching reactions with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades analyzing subtext. Michael, she said, cornering her nephew near the fireplace, I've been meaning to ask you about those trust disbursements we discussed last month. The ones for the University Scholarship Fund. Michael's expression flickered almost imperceptibly, anxiety quickly masked by practiced confidence. Everything's proceeding exactly as planned, Aunt Ellie. In fact, I've been meaning to discuss some excellent new investment opportunities with you. Why don't we step into the study after dinner? That would be lovely, Eleanor replied, her hand brushing the recorder in her pocket. I've been thinking a lot about my legacy recently. The holiday. The foundation represented everything she and William had valued: education, historical preservation, literary scholarship, while removing control from those who had betrayed that vision. And the restitution schedule, she asked, touching the green folder that contained the agreements her family had signed on Christmas night. Michael transferred the first installment yesterday, $400,000 returned to your primary accounts. Charlotte and Thomas have liquidated their vacation property in Napa to cover their portion. The full $1.2 million should be restored by the end of February. The financial recovery was proceeding more efficiently than the emotional one. No family member had contacted Eleanor directly since Christmas night. Instead, all communications came through attorneys, formal, detached exchanges about asset transfers and legal obligations. Has there been any movement on the competency question? Eleanor asked, the concern that had kept her awake through January nights. Amelia's expression hardened. They wouldn't dare, not with the evidence you've secured. The agreements they signed include explicit acknowledgement of your cognitive competence. Any challenge would trigger the penalty clauses and public disclosure provisions. People desperate to protect their reputations might risk financial penalties, Eleanor observed. Especially if they believe they can convince a court that those agreements were signed under duress. Which is precisely why we've scheduled your comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation for next week, Amelia reminded her. Dr. Patterson is the state's leading expert on cognitive assessment in high-functioning older adults. Her certification of your competence will be virtually unassailable in court. Eleanor sipped her tea, considering the strange battlefield her life had become, medical evaluations as defensive maneuvers, legal documents as weapons, trust transformed into strategic advantage. This was never the retirement she and William had envisioned during their decades of planning. There's something else, Amelia said, hesitation evident in her voice. James Harrington has filed an ethics complaint against me with the Washington State Bar Association, claiming I've taken advantage of an elderly client with diminished capacity. He's trying to remove you as my attorney, Eleanor stated flatly. Predictable. What's our countermove? I've already filed a countercomplaint, detailing his failure to disclose conflicts of interest while representing both you and Michael simultaneously. The documentation you provided showing he dismissed your concerns about unauthorized transfers while actively facilitating them is damning. The chess game continued. Every action by her family and their enablers met with a carefully planned response. Eleanor had discovered a talent for strategic thinking that decades in academia had honed but never fully deployed. The newspaper called again, Amelia mentioned, changing topics. The Seattle Times reporter is quite persistent. She believes your story could help other elderly individuals recognize and fight financial exploitation. Eleanor had been declining media requests since a financial columnist had somehow learned of the Blackwood family dispute in early January. The prospect of public exposure conflicted with her natural privacy and her lingering protective instincts toward the family members who had betrayed her. I'm not interested in public vindication or humiliation, Eleanor replied. My goal is justice and protection, not revenge. Sometimes, Amelia said carefully, your personal story can create protection for others. The reporter mentioned that elder financial abuse cases have increased 38% in Washington over the past 5 years, with family members being the perpetrators in nearly 60% of cases. The statistics settled heavily on Eleanor's shoulders. How many others were facing what she had confronted, the gradual realization of betrayal, the dismissal of their concerns, the isolation that made them vulnerable to further exploitation? Let me think about it, she conceded. But my focus now needs to be securing the foundation and ensuring my own legal protections are unassailable. After Amelia departed, Eleanor walked through her silent house, each room still bearing the invisible imprints of Christmas confrontations. The dining room where relatives had boasted of extravagant vacations funded by her diverted assets. The study where Charlotte, Michael, and Thomas had first denied, then admitted, then rationalized their systematic betrayal. Her phone rang. Judith Abernathy from next door, the retired nurse whose well-meaning surveillance had inadvertently alerted Charlotte to Eleanor's late-night investigations. Eleanor, dear, I made too much beef stew again. I thought perhaps you might join me for dinner? You shouldn't be alone so much, especially with this dreadful weather. The invitation carried no hidden agenda, no financial motive, just the simple compassion of one widow for another. The contrast with her family's complex manipulations made Eleanor's throat tighten. That would be lovely, Judith. Shall I bring dessert? An hour later, seated in Judith's cozy kitchen with homemade stew and fresh bread, Eleanor felt a weight lifting. Here was human connection without exploitation, concern without control, generosity without calculation. You seem different lately, Judith observed, refilling Eleanor's water glass. More focused, perhaps. But also more distant. I've had some family challenges to navigate, Eleanor admitted, offering the understated truth that academics excelled at crafting. Family, Judith nodded knowingly. My sister's children tried something similar after Harold passed. Suddenly. Very concerned about my memory whenever I questioned their access to my accounts. Eleanor's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. You too? Oh, mine was amateur hour compared to what I suspect you've faced, Judith said with unexpected frankness. Harold was a financial planner, he left everything locked down tight with independent trustees. But the pattern is depressingly common. Widows with assets become targets, often by the very people who should be protecting them. The revelation that Judith had recognized Eleanor's situation without being told created a bridge between them, two women who had faced similar betrayals, one with the protection of professional foresight, one forced to create her own defenses after the fact. How did you handle the relationship damage? Eleanor asked, voicing the question that had troubled her most since Christmas night. Judith considered this while breaking apart a piece of crusty bread. I established boundaries, clear as fortress walls. Financial discussions became off-limits. With certain relatives. Some relationships cooled permanently. Others eventually recovered once they understood I wouldn't be manipulated. She looked directly at Eleanor. But I never again confused love with access to resources. The simple wisdom struck Eleanor with the force of revelation. Her academic career had focused on analyzing literary relationships, fictional characters, whose motives and actions could be dissected with scholarly precision. But she had failed to apply that same analytical rigor to her own family dynamics, allowing sentiment to obscure the exploitation occurring right before her eyes. I've established a foundation, Eleanor found herself explaining, to ensure my estate serves its intended purposes regardless of family pressures. Good, Judith said firmly. Use your experiences to create something meaningful. That's how we transform pain into purpose. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, community news, book recommendations, memories of teaching careers, but Judith's words about transforming pain into purpose remained with Eleanor long after she returned home, echoing in the empty rooms of her Victorian house. The next morning, she made two decisions that would alter the trajectory of her remaining years. First, she called the Seattle Times reporter and agreed to an interview, with specific conditions: no photographs, no naming of family members, and a focus on education about elder financial abuse rather than the sensational aspects of her personal story. Second, she contacted Dr. Lydia Montgomery at the University of Washington School of Social Work, a former colleague whose research focused on elder justice initiatives. If Eleanor's experience could inform prevention programs or legislative reforms, perhaps the betrayal she had endured could protect others from similar exploitation. Dr. Patterson's neuropsychological evaluation took place the following week, 6 hours of comprehensive cognitive testing that would have been grueling for someone half Eleanor's age. Memory, executive function, verbal reasoning, abstract thinking, each aspect of mental acuity measured and documented with scientific precision. You performed exceptionally well, Dr. Patterson informed her during the follow-up consultation. In several areas, particularly verbal reasoning and analytical thinking, you scored in the 95th percentile compared to individuals decades younger. There is absolutely no evidence of cognitive impairment or dementia. The validation should have brought comfort, but instead highlighted the cruelty of her family's dementia narrative, a calculated strategy rather than a genuine concern, a convenient fiction designed to seize control of her assets while silencing her objections. Will your evaluation stand up to legal challenges? Eleanor asked, the scholar's precision overriding emotional reactions. My assessment would be considered the gold standard in any competency hearing. Dr. Patterson assured her. I've included specific findings addressing financial decision-making capacity and vulnerability to undue influence. The report explicitly states that you demonstrate the judgment and cognitive abilities necessary to manage complex financial matters independently. Another shield added to her defenses, another counterpoint to potential challenges from those who had once been her presumed protectors. The Seattle Times interview took place in Eleanor's study, the reporter, Sophia Martinez, recording their conversation while rain lashed against the windows, creating a somber backdrop for discussions of betrayal and resilience. What warning signs should older adults and their legitimate advocates watch for? Sophia asked, after Eleanor had outlined her experience in carefully anonymized terms. Isolation is the first strategy, Eleanor explained, drawing on both her personal experience and the research she had conducted in recent weeks. Legitimate concerns dismissed as confusion or paranoia. Unnecessary supervision of activities the individual has managed independently for decades. Restricted access to financial information or abrupt changes in financial advisors. And perhaps most insidious, casual comments about memory lapses or cognitive decline, especially in front of others who might later be called as witnesses. As she articulated these patterns, Eleanor recognized how systematically they had been deployed against her, not random actions but a coordinated campaign to undermine her autonomy while maintaining a facade of concern. How can people protect themselves? Sophia asked, the question that would become the centerpiece of the resulting article. Documentation is critical, Eleanor answered, thinking of the files she had compiled, the recordings she had made, the evidence that had ultimately forced accountability. Independent advisors with no connection to family members who might influence them. Regular cognitive assessments established as baseline measures before any crisis emerges. And perhaps most importantly, a willingness to recognize that loving someone doesn't mean they won't exploit you under the right circumstances. The last observation had been the most painful lesson of Eleanor's experience, the recognition that Charlotte, whom she had raised with values of integrity and compassion, had participated in her exploitation while genuinely believing she was acting in her mother's best interest. Your story will help others, Sophia said as she gathered her recording equipment. Many victims of elder financial abuse never find the strength or resources to fight back as effectively as you have. I had advantages many don't, Eleanor acknowledged. Financial resources, educational background, professional connections. The real challenge is creating protections for those without such privileges. That challenge became the focus of Eleanor's collaboration with Dr. Montgomery at the University of Washington. Together, they designed a research initiative examining systemic vulnerabilities in elder protection laws and developing intervention programs for at-risk older adults. The William Blackwood Foundation provided initial funding for a pilot program, free legal clinics specializing in elder financial protection, educational workshops about recognizing exploitation, and advocacy training for healthcare providers who often served as first-line observers of potential abuse. These projects filled Eleanor's days with purpose, transforming her private trauma into public benefit. But the nights remained difficult, haunted by unanswered questions about family relationships that seemed beyond repair. Charlotte had made no direct contact since Christmas, though her attorney regularly communicated with Amelia regarding the restitution payments. The grandchildren's scheduled visits had been cancelled without explanation. Even Elena, William's sister in Portland who had not been involved in the financial exploitation, had grown distant after learning of the confrontation. The family isolation is by design, Dr. Montgomery explained during one of their research meetings. It's a control mechanism, behave as we wish or face complete estrangement. They're hoping the emotional pain of separation will eventually force you to capitulate, to drop the accountability demands in exchange for restored relationships. They misunderstand what relationships actually are, Eleanor replied. Connection. Without honesty isn't intimacy, it's performance. I won't trade truth for theatrical family gatherings where everyone pretends exploitation never occurred. Yet despite this clarity, the absence of family during her 72nd birthday in late February carried a particular sting. The cards that didn't arrive, the calls not made, the traditions abandoned, each represented a secondary loss layered atop the primary betrayal. Eleanor marked the day instead with a small dinner gathering of new allies, Amelia Chen, Judith Abernathy, Dr. Montgomery, and two colleagues from her university days who had reached out after the Seattle Times article appeared. To new beginnings, Judith toasted, raising her glass in Eleanor's sunroom where the winter sky had cleared enough to reveal stars above the sound. And to boundaries that protect rather than isolate. The sentiment captured Eleanor's evolving perspective. The boundaries she had established weren't walls of isolation but rather frameworks for integrity, defining the conditions under which authentic relationships could exist. A week after her birthday, the unexpected occurred. A letter arrived from Charlotte, not through attorneys but personal correspondence, handwritten on the stationery Eleanor had given her for Christmas years earlier. Eleanor studied the envelope for long minutes before opening it, noting the Portland postmark, the familiar slant of her daughter's handwriting, the care taken to write her full name and address as if Charlotte feared more casual familiarity might cause the letter to be returned unread. Inside, 3 pages of reflection, apology, and tentative outreach. I've spent weeks trying to justify my actions, Charlotte wrote. Telling myself I was protecting you from Michael's more aggressive strategies, that my participation was a form of harm reduction, that I genuinely believed your financial interests were being properly managed despite the unconventional methods. But the truth, which Dr. Linden has helped me confront in therapy, is simpler and more shameful. I saw opportunity and chose exploitation over protection. I betrayed not just your trust but everything you and Dad taught me about integrity. The acknowledgement, offered without qualification or expectation, represented the first crack in the wall of denial her family had constructed. Charlotte continued with specific admissions about her role in the scheme, her awareness of the planned competency challenge, and her failure to intervene even when she recognized the exploitation. I'm not asking for forgiveness, the letter concluded. I'm not even asking for a response. I simply needed to acknowledge the truth of what I did and take responsibility without expectations or conditions. The foundation you've established is exactly what Dad would have wanted. The work you're doing to protect others from what we did to you is transforming harm into healing in ways I can only admire from a distance. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, each reading stirring different emotions: vindication, sorrow, cautious hope that at least one relationship might eventually find a path toward authentic reconciliation. She did not respond immediately, allowing herself time to process Charlotte's words and examine her own readiness for even limited reconnection. True healing required more than acknowledgement, it demanded sustained change and demonstrated trustworthiness over time. Instead, she channeled her energy into expanding the Foundation's work. The initial research project with Dr. Montgomery had identified a critical gap in Washington's elder protection system: the lack of emergency legal services for older adults facing immediate financial exploitation or competency challenges. By the time conventional legal aid can respond, the damage is often done, Eleanor explained to the Foundation's Board of Trustees. Bank accounts emptied, documents signed under duress, assets transferred beyond recovery. She proposed establishing an emergency response team, attorneys, financial forensic specialists, and geriatric social workers available on short notice to intervene when exploitation was actively occurring. "We'll call it the Rapid Intervention for Elder Security Team, REIST," she told Amelia during their weekly meeting. The Foundation can fund the pilot program for 3 years, enough time to gather data on effectiveness and pursue state funding if the model proves successful. "You found your mission," Amelia observed. "I've seen this transformation before. In clients who've experienced exploitation, the determination to create meaning from trauma, to ensure others don't suffer similar harm. It's not entirely altruistic," Eleanor admitted. "The work keeps me focused on solutions rather than dwelling on betrayals. It gives purpose to an experience that might otherwise feel merely painful and pointless." This perspective was tested a month later when Michael's attorney contacted Amelia with an unexpected proposition. In exchange for modifying the confidentiality provisions of their agreement, Michael offered to provide documentation of similar financial exploitation schemes operating in 3 other Seattle investment firms. "He's looking to negotiate leniency," Amelia explained during their emergency meeting. "The Washington State Bar Association is investigating his conduct based on information that became public after the Times article. He's offering to become a whistleblower against larger operations in exchange for your agreement not to pursue further legal action against him." The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. Her nephew, who had orchestrated her exploitation, now seeking protection by exposing others who had employed similar tactics. "What's your assessment?" she asked Amelia. "Is his information valuable enough to justify modifying our agreement?" "From a justice perspective, yes," Amelia replied. "The firms he's identified manage hundreds of millions in assets, much of it belonging to elderly clients. The exploitation is apparently systematic and sophisticated. His testimony could help state regulators shut down operations that are harming many vulnerable people." Eleanor considered the proposition, weighing personal vindication against broader protection for others who might be victimized. "Tell Michael I'll consider modifying our confidentiality agreement under specific conditions," she decided. "He must provide complete documentation to state regulators, cooperate fully with investigations, and make public acknowledgement of his own misconduct rather than presenting himself as an innocent whistleblower." The negotiation illustrated how fundamentally Eleanor's approach had evolved in the months since the Christmas confrontation. Her focus had shifted from personal protection to systemic change, from private justice to public accountability. This evolution became even more apparent when Dr. Montgomery invited Eleanor to testify before a state legislative committee considering reforms to Washington's elder protection laws. "Your combination of personal experience and academic credibility makes you an ideal advocate," Dr. Montgomery argued. "Legislators respond to compelling narratives backed by research and practical recommendations." The prospect of public testimony represented a significant departure from Eleanor's previous reluctance to expose her family's betrayal. But the potential impact of legislative reforms, expanded legal protections, mandatory reporting requirements for financial institutions, increased penalties for exploitation, outweighed her privacy concerns. "I'll testify," she agreed, "but I want to focus on solutions rather than my personal victimization. The goal is systemic change, not public shaming of my family." As winter yielded to early spring, Eleanor found herself at the center of a growing advocacy network. The Seattle Times article had generated responses from dozens of older adults facing similar exploitation, many of whom now received assistance through the Foundation's programs. The research partnership with the University of Washington had expanded to include collaborative projects with elder justice initiatives in Oregon and California. The Victorian house on Whidbey Island, once the setting for family gatherings that masked exploitation, had transformed into an informal headquarters for what Eleanor called her third act, not the quiet retirement she and William had planned. but a purposeful engagement with issues they had never anticipated facing. One afternoon in early April, as cherry blossoms began to appear in Seattle gardens, Eleanor sat in her sunroom reviewing testimony for the upcoming legislative hearing. Judith joined her, bringing freshly baked scones and the companionship that had become a steady comfort in recent months. "Charlotte called me yesterday," Judith mentioned casually, arranging scones on the plate between them. Eleanor looked up sharply. "About me?" "About you," Judith confirmed. "She asked if you were truly doing as well as the newspaper article suggested, or if it was a public facade covering private distress." "And what did you tell her?" "The truth," Judith replied, passing Eleanor a scone. "That you've transformed personal betrayal into meaningful purpose. That you have good days and difficult ones. That you've built new connections while leaving space for restored relationships under the right conditions." Eleanor considered this assessment, recognizing its accuracy. The pain of family betrayal remained, a background ache that occasionally flared into sharper grief. But it no longer defined her daily existence or dictated her future choices. "She's trying to find her way back," Judith added gently. "On terms that respect your boundaries rather than challenging them. Reconciliation requires more than apology," Eleanor said, repeating the principle that had guided her limited responses to Charlotte's outreach attempts. "It demands demonstrated change over time." "Yes," Judith agreed. "And perhaps also the recognition that people can genuinely change when confronted with the consequences of their actions. Your daughter seems to be doing the work of honest self-examination." Eleanor nodded, acknowledging the possibility without commitment. The path forward with Charlotte, if one existed, would unfold gradually, built on demonstrated trustworthiness rather than rushed forgiveness or convenient amnesia about past betrayals. For now, her focus remained on the legislative testimony and the Foundation's expanding programs. The William Blackwood Foundation had recently funded its 10th emergency intervention for an elder facing active financial exploitation, successfully preventing the transfer of assets and connecting the victim with ongoing legal protection. Each successful intervention represented a counternarrative to exploitation, evidence that vulnerability need not lead to victimization, that age need not mean powerlessness, that families could be held accountable when they betrayed the trust of their elders. As she prepared her testimony for state legislators, Eleanor reflected on the journey from that snowy December night when she had first discovered her family's betrayal. The path had been neither straight nor easy. The losses, of trust, of family harmony, of naive assumptions about protection, had been profound and painful. Yet from those losses had emerged unexpected gains, deeper authenticity in remaining relationships, clearer boundaries based on demonstrated trustworthiness rather than mere familiarity, and perhaps most significantly, a mission that transformed personal trauma into collective protection. "You've created something powerful from something painful," Judith observed, seeming to follow Eleanor's unspoken reflections. "That's no small achievement at any age." Eleanor smiled at her friend, grateful for the companionship that asked nothing beyond mutual respect and genuine concern. William used to quote Hemingway to his students, she remembered. "The world breaks everyone, and afterward, many are strong at the broken places." I never fully understood what that meant. Until now. The broken places remained, family relationships fractured by betrayal, trust shattered by exploitation, assumptions destroyed by experience. But in and around those fractures, new strength had developed, clarity of purpose, unwavering boundaries, and the determination to ensure that other elders would not face exploitation without recourse. As she finalized her testimony for the Legislative Committee, Eleanor Blackwood, 72 years old, betrayed but undefeated, recognized that disappearing from her family's will had ultimately revealed her true inheritance, not the financial assets they had attempted to steal, but the resilience, integrity, and courage that no one could take without her consent. 6 months after Eleanor Blackwood's testimony before the Washington state legislature, the governor signed the Elder Financial Protection Act into law on the Capitol steps in Olympia. Known informally as Eleanor's Law, the legislation created the nation's most comprehensive protections against family-based financial exploitation of older adults. Eleanor stood in the autumn sunshine beside Dr. Montgomery and Amelia Chen, watching as the governor used 7 ceremonial pens to sign the document that represented both personal vindication and systemic change. Each pen stroke formalized protections that would have prevented her own exploitation: mandatory financial institution reporting of suspicious transactions, expedited court proceedings for elder exploitation cases, enhanced penalties for familial perpetrators, and funding for emergency intervention services modeled on the William Blackwood Foundation's pioneering program. "This wouldn't have happened without your courage," Dr. Montgomery whispered as cameras captured the historic moment. Your willingness to transform private pain into public advocacy made these protections possible. The comment captured Eleanor's journey over the preceding 10 months, from isolated victim to influential advocate, from betrayed grandmother to respected authority on elder justice issues. The path had been neither straightforward nor painless. But standing in the crisp October air as her experience became enshrined in protective legislation, Eleanor felt the deep satisfaction of purpose fulfilled. At the reception following the signing ceremony, the governor approached Eleanor with unexpected familiarity. "My mother experienced something similar," she confided, her public persona momentarily set aside. "Cousins who managed to drain nearly half her retirement before we discovered what was happening. We couldn't prove enough for criminal charges, and the civil case dragged on until she passed away." "I'm sorry," Eleanor replied, recognizing the personal motivation behind the governor's support for the legislation. "That's precisely why these protections matter. Justice delayed is often justice denied for older adults with limited remaining years." She asked, neither accepting nor rejecting the proposal outright. "Interviews with you, foundation staff, and program beneficiaries who are willing to share their experiences. Footage of our emergency response team in action, with appropriate privacy protections. Expert commentary on the broader context of elder exploitation. They're offering substantial creative control, including final approval on how your personal story is presented." Eleanor considered the potential impact against the personal exposure. A nationally broadcast documentary could raise awareness far beyond what her legislative testimony or regional media coverage had accomplished. It could help other older adults recognize exploitation patterns before significant damage occurred. It could inspire other elder abuse survivors to transform their experiences into advocacy. "Tell them I'm interested in discussing parameters," she decided. "But my primary concern is ensuring the documentary serves educational purposes rather than treating elder exploitation as entertainment." The documentary discussions added another dimension to Eleanor's expanding advocacy work. In addition to the governor's task force and the foundation's growing programs, she had begun mentoring other elder abuse survivors who wanted to transform their experiences into effective advocacy. These mentoring relationships brought unexpected joy to Eleanor's third act, the opportunity to help others reclaim power after experiences that had left them feeling powerless and isolated. She recognized in their initial hesitation and subsequent determination reflections of her own journey. From betrayed grandmother to influential advocate. As autumn progressed toward winter, Eleanor received another unexpected communication, an email from Thomas, Charlotte's husband, who had participated in the financial exploitation but remained largely in the background during subsequent accountability discussions. "I've been working with Charlotte in our marriage counseling sessions to understand my role in the harm we caused you," he wrote. "While legal agreements have addressed financial restitution, I haven't personally acknowledged my actions or taken responsibility for the breach of trust. I exploited my position as your son-in-law and financial advisor to enrich myself at your expense, violating both professional ethics and family obligations. There is no justification for these actions, and I am profoundly sorry for the harm I caused." The email continued with specific acknowledgement of his professional misconduct, the marriage tensions that had resulted from the exposure of their actions, and the counseling process that had led to this direct communication. "Charlotte and I are learning to rebuild our relationship on foundations of honesty and mutual accountability rather than financial opportunism and shared secrets. I don't expect this acknowledgement to repair the damage to our family relationship, but I hope it contributes to your healing to know that your courage in confronting our exploitation has led to genuine personal transformation." Eleanor forwarded the email to Amelia with a brief note, another step toward accountability. No response needed yet, but worth documenting as part of the overall reconciliation process. The accumulation of these acknowledgments, first Charlotte, then Michael, now Thomas, created a complex emotional landscape for Eleanor. She had neither sought nor expected such comprehensive accountability when she first confronted their exploitation. Her initial goals had been protection of her assets and autonomy, not transformation of those who had betrayed her. Yet the unexpected outcome brought a certain validation. Her refusal to accept exploitation, to be silenced by family pressure, or to prioritize artificial harmony over authentic accountability had created space for genuine reflection and potential growth among those who had caused harm. December brought the anniversary of her initial discovery, 1 full year since that snowy night when she had first uncovered evidence of her family's betrayal. The date carried emotional weight, a marker of both trauma and transformation. Rather than spend the evening alone with difficult memories, Eleanor invited her closest allies for dinner at the Victorian house, Judith, Dr. Montgomery, Amelia, Simone, and 2 elder abuse survivors she had mentored through their own advocacy journeys. "I propose a toast," Judith offered as they gathered in the dining room where family confrontations had occurred exactly 1 year earlier. "To Eleanor, who transformed betrayal into blessing for countless others who will never know her name but will benefit from her courage. And to all of you," Eleanor responded, raising her glass in return, "who demonstrated that community can be built on shared values rather than mere biology, that meaningful connection doesn't require exploitation or manipulation, that authentic relationships thrive on mutual respect rather than power imbalances." The dinner conversation flowed through topics serious and light: legislative implementation challenges, documentary filming schedules, holiday plans, book recommendations, and the particular pleasures of winter on Whidbey Island. Throughout the evening, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how thoroughly her life had transformed in a single year. The pain of family betrayal remained, a background ache that occasionally intensified during significant dates or unexpected reminders. But it no longer defined her daily existence or dictated her future choices. Instead, it had become integrated into her life story, a challenging chapter that had led to unexpected growth and connection rather than a devastating conclusion. After her guests departed, Eleanor sat in her study reviewing the Foundation's annual report: 47 successful interventions, 3 research publications, policy reforms in 2 states, and educational programs that had trained over 500 elder care professionals to recognize and respond to exploitation. These tangible outcomes measured the external impact of her advocacy. But the internal transformation felt equally significant: the evolution from isolated victim to connected advocate, from betrayed grandmother to respected authority, from reactive survivor to proactive change agent. A text message interrupted her reflections, Charlotte checking in as she now did several times each week: "Thinking of you on this difficult anniversary. So grateful for your willingness to allow limited reconnection despite the harm we caused. Thomas and I would like to visit in January if you're comfortable with that step." The request represented another potential milestone in the careful rebuilding process. Eleanor had not yet welcomed family members back to the Victorian house where the exploitation and confrontation had occurred. Such a visit would carry symbolic weight beyond routine communication. "I'll consider it," she texted back. "Let's discuss parameters after the holidays." The measured response reflected Eleanor's evolved approach to family relationships, neither cutting off possibility for authentic reconnection nor rushing reconciliation before sufficient accountability and change had been demonstrated. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor found herself drawn to William's desk drawer where she still kept the recording devices that had captured her family's exploitation discussions a year earlier. The recordings had served their purpose as protection against gaslighting and evidence of wrongdoing. Yet she continued to preserve them, not as weapons, but as reminders of both vulnerability and strength. "I wonder what you would think of all this, William," she spoke aloud to the empty room. "Your foundation helping others, your name associated with protection rather than exploitation, your ethical principles vindicated even as family relationships were fractured and partially rebuilt." The following morning brought unexpected news: a certified letter from James Harrington announcing his retirement from legal practice following ethical sanctions related to his handling of Eleanor's concerns about unauthorized transfers. The disciplinary committee had stopped short of disbarment but had imposed significant practice restrictions and mandatory ethics education. "Another consequence I never specifically sought but don't regret," Eleanor observed to Amelia during their weekly meeting. "Accountability seems to ripple outward from that initial confrontation, reaching even those who believed themselves insulated from consequences." "That's often how justice works," Amelia noted. "Not as a single dramatic moment but as a process that unfolds over time, affecting different participants in different ways." The observation captured Eleanor's evolved understanding of justice: not merely punishment or vindication, but transformation of systems that enabled exploitation and accountability that created potential for genuine change. As winter solstice approached, bringing the year's longest night and the promise of gradually returning light, Eleanor received an unexpected invitation: a request from the American Bar Association to deliver the keynote address at their annual Elder Law Conference in February. "They specifically want you to address the intersection of personal experience and systemic advocacy," Simone explained when forwarding the invitation. "Your combination of academic background and lived experience makes you uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between legal theory and practical protection." The invitation represented yet another expansion of Eleanor's influence, from regional advocate to national voice. "Exactly," the governor agreed. "Which is why I'm establishing a task force to monitor implementation and recommend additional reforms as needed. We'd like you to serve as co-chair, if you're willing." The invitation represented another unexpected evolution in Eleanor's third act, formal recognition of expertise developed through lived experience and dedicated research. Her academic background had given her the analytical tools to study elder exploitation, while her personal experience provided insights no scholarly article could convey. "I'd be honored," Eleanor accepted, "particularly if we can ensure the task force includes both professionals and survivors of exploitation. Multiple perspectives will strengthen our recommendations." As the reception concluded, Eleanor checked her phone to find a text message from Charlotte. "Just saw the bill signing on local news. So proud of what you've accomplished. Your strength continues to inspire me to do better." The simple acknowledgement, neither demanding response nor seeking absolution, reflected the careful rebuilding process that had begun in recent months. After 9 months of limited communication conducted primarily through letters and occasional brief phone calls, Eleanor had finally agreed to meet Charlotte for lunch during a foundation trip to Portland in August. That first face-to-face encounter. Since the Christmas confrontation had been neither emotionally effusive nor artificially strained, instead, a measured reconnection based on Charlotte's continued acknowledgement of her actions and Eleanor's cautious openness to authentic reconciliation. "I've been working with a therapist specializing in financial psychology," Charlotte had explained over their meal. "Understanding why I participated in something that violated everything you and Dad taught me about integrity." "And what have you learned?" Eleanor had asked, more curious than accusatory. "That I inherited Dad's financial anxiety but not his ethical framework for managing it," Charlotte admitted. "His childhood poverty created patterns he transformed into principled frugality. I absorbed the fear without the moral counterbalance." The insight had impressed Eleanor with its self-awareness and absence of justification. Charlotte wasn't excusing her actions but seeking to understand them as a means of ensuring they never recurred. Now, as Eleanor prepared to return to Whidbey Island following the bill signing, she texted back a simple acknowledgement, "Thank you. Small steps in the right direction matter, both in legislation and relationships." The drive home gave Eleanor time to reflect on how thoroughly her life had transformed since that snowy December night when she first discovered her family's betrayal. The William Blackwood Foundation had grown from concept to influential institution, with programs in 3 states and a staff of 7 dedicated professionals. The research partnership with the University of Washington had produced groundbreaking studies on family-based financial exploitation, with Eleanor as co-author on 2 peer-reviewed papers. Most significantly, the narrative surrounding elder exploitation had begun to shift from tragic inevitability to preventable injustice. Eleanor's public advocacy, her willingness to share her experience while demanding systemic solutions, had helped reframe the issue from private family matter to public health concern. As she drove through the October landscape, leaves turning crimson and gold against evergreen backdrops, Eleanor considered how her personal landscape had similarly transformed. The isolation that had initially followed her confrontation with family betrayal had given way to new connections based on shared purpose rather than mere biology or tradition. Judith Abernathy had become not just a neighbor but a cherished friend, their evening conversations ranging from literature to politics to the particular challenges of aging in a society that often dismissed elder wisdom. Dr. Montgomery was both colleague and confidant, their professional collaboration enriched by mutual respect that occasionally blossomed into friendship beyond research parameters. Amelia Chen had evolved from legal representative to trusted advisor, helping Eleanor navigate not just the legal complexities of her case but the emotional terrain of establishing new boundaries with family members as limited reconciliation became possible. Even her relationship with Charlotte had found a tentative new foundation, not the unquestioning trust of the past, but a measured reconnection based on demonstrated change rather than mere promises. Eleanor arrived home as sunset painted Puget Sound in shades of amber and rose. The Victorian house that had once felt like a stage for family performances now served as both sanctuary and headquarters, its rooms adapted to accommodate foundation meetings, research collaborations, and occasional gatherings of the emerging community Eleanor had built around shared values rather than obligatory connections. As she prepared a simple dinner, Eleanor's phone rang, Michael's name appearing on the screen for the first time since their legal negotiations months earlier. "Aunt Ellie," he began when she answered, his voice carrying an unfamiliar hesitation. "I saw the bill signing today. Congratulations." "Thank you," she replied, her tone neutral rather than warm. Unlike Charlotte, Michael had offered strategic cooperation but never genuine acknowledgement of the harm he had caused. "I'm calling because the State Bar Association has completed its investigation," he continued. "Based on my cooperation with regulatory authorities and the testimony I provided against larger exploitation operations, they've suspended my license for 1 year rather than pursuing disbarment." Eleanor waited, sensing there was more to this unexpected call than a status update on professional consequences. The suspension has given me time to reflect, Michael added after a pause. I've been working with a forensic psychologist who specializes in white-collar offenders, trying to understand how I justified actions that were clearly wrong by any ethical standard. The parallel to Charlotte's therapeutic process was striking, though Eleanor remained more skeptical of Michael's motivations given his history of strategic manipulation. That sounds like important work, she offered, neither dismissing his efforts nor offering easy absolution. It is, he agreed. And part of that work involves direct acknowledgement to those I've harmed. I exploited your trust, Aunt Ellie. I abused my position as executor to divert funds for personal benefit. I attempted to have you declared incompetent to cover my actions. And when confronted, I tried to manipulate my way out of accountability rather than accepting responsibility. The straightforward admission, offered without qualification or expectation, represented a significant departure from Michael's previous approach of strategic cooperation without personal accountability. I'm not asking for forgiveness or restoration of relationship, he continued. I'm simply acknowledging the truth of what I did and taking responsibility for the harm it caused. Thank you for that acknowledgement, Eleanor replied, recognizing its value while maintaining appropriate boundaries. I hope your work with the psychologist proves transformative. After they disconnected, Eleanor sat in William's chair, considering the unexpected outreach. Unlike Charlotte's gradual process of accountability and amends, Michael's acknowledgement felt more sudden, perhaps prompted by professional consequences rather than genuine remorse. Yet she had learned to accept accountability whenever it appeared, without cynicism about motivations or naivete about implications. Michael's acknowledgement neither erased his actions nor obligated her to restore trust, but it represented a small step toward truth in a relationship that had been built on deception. The following morning, Eleanor met with the Foundation's Executive Director, Dr. Simone Washington, to discuss expanding their emergency intervention program to Oregon and Idaho. The demand keeps growing, Simone explained, reviewing the quarterly statistics. We've handled 37 cases in Washington alone this quarter. Each success generates more referrals as elder care providers recognize the signs of exploitation and know we can respond quickly. We'll need additional funding for multi-state expansion, Eleanor noted, considering potential resources. I'll approach the Robertson Family Foundation about a matching grant. Their focus on rural elder services aligns with our need to reach isolated communities in eastern Oregon and northern Idaho. The foundation work had become Eleanor's primary focus, the mechanism through which her personal experience generated collective protection. Each successful intervention represented not just an individual saved from exploitation but a demonstration that predatory practices could be effectively challenged. There's something else, Simone added, her expression reflecting both excitement and caution. PBS has approached us about featuring our work in a documentary on elder justice. They're particularly interested in your personal journey from victim to advocate, seeing it as the narrative thread that could make complex issues accessible to general audiences. The prospect of sharing her story through such a public medium triggered Eleanor's initial privacy instincts. The careful boundaries she had maintained around her family's betrayal had served important protective functions during her recovery and advocacy development. What would the documentary involve? From foundation director to field leader, from survivor seeking personal justice to authority guiding professional practice. Tell them I will accept, Eleanor decided, already considering key themes for the address. I want to focus on the ethical obligations legal professionals have when representing older clients, particularly when family members claim to be acting in the client's best interest. On the winter solstice, Eleanor hosted a small gathering at her home, not the traditional family celebration of previous years but a circle of friends and allies marking both the longest night and the promise of returning light. Judith brought her famous gingerbread. Dr. Montgomery contributed mulled wine. Amelia shared Lebanese holiday traditions from her childhood. As they sat before the fireplace in Eleanor's living room, candles illuminating faces that had become central to her reconstructed life, Judith raised an unexpected question. If you could go back to that December night when you first discovered the exploitation, would you change how you responded? Eleanor considered the question carefully, weighing the pain and loss against the purpose and connection that had emerged from her confrontation with betrayal. I would not change my decision to demand accountability, she answered finally. But I might have recognized sooner that the process would transform me as thoroughly as it transformed my relationships. I was initially focused on protection and justice. I did not anticipate discovering new purpose or building new community. That is often how meaningful third acts emerge, Dr. Montgomery observed. Not from careful planning but from courageous responses to unexpected challenges. The observation resonated with Eleanor's experience. Nothing about her current life matched the retirement she and William had envisioned during their decades of planning. The advocacy work, foundation, leadership, policy influence, and mentoring relationships had all emerged from a crisis she neither anticipated nor deserved. Yet from that crisis had come clarity about what mattered most, not just financial security or family harmony, but integrity, purpose, and authentic connection. The wealth her family had attempted to steal had ultimately proven less valuable than the wisdom she had gained through confronting their betrayal. As midnight approached, marking the year's longest night, Eleanor invited her guests to participate in a solstice tradition she had practiced with William, writing intentions for the coming year's increasing light. Not resolutions about changing ourselves, she explained, distributing small pieces of paper, but intentions about how we wish to direct our energy as daylight gradually returns. Each person wrote privately, then sealed their intention in an envelope, to be opened at summer solstice when light reached its fullest expression. The ritual acknowledged both current reflection and future hope, both personal autonomy and shared ceremony. After her guests departed, Eleanor sat alone before the dying fire, considering her own written intention to transform the remaining pain of betrayal into even more effective protection for others, to balance accountability with possibility for restoration, to create meaning from what was never meant to be meaningful. The Victorian house stood silent around her, no longer a stage for family performances but a headquarters for purposeful transformation. The rooms that had witnessed exploitation and confrontation now hosted foundation meetings, survivor support gatherings, and authentic connections based on shared values rather than mere obligation. 1 year after discovering her family's betrayal, Eleanor Blackwood, 72 years old, sat in peaceful solitude, contemplating both the longest night and the gradually returning light. The darkness of betrayal remained real but no longer overwhelming. The light of purpose, community, and impact grew stronger with each passing day. She had disappeared from her family's will only to discover her true inheritance, not the financial assets they had attempted to steal, but the resilience, wisdom, and courage that had transformed private trauma into public protection. As she banked the fire for the night, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this unexpected third act. The path had been neither straight nor easy. The losses of trust, of family harmony, of innocent assumptions about protection had been genuine and painful. Yet from those losses had emerged unexpected gains, deeper authenticity in remaining relationships, clearer boundaries based on demonstrated trustworthiness, and a mission that transformed personal trauma into collective protection. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her bedroom, passing family photographs that now represented a complex reality rather than an idealized fiction. The images captured genuine moments of connection alongside relationships that had contained hidden exploitation. Both were true. Both were part of her story. As she prepared for sleep on the year's longest night, Eleanor considered how thoroughly her understanding of legacy had transformed. What she would leave behind was not merely financial assets or family harmony, but systemic protections that would benefit countless vulnerable elders, research that would inform future advocacy, and a foundation that would continue her work long after she was gone. Her family had ignored her at the reunion, only to discover she could disappear from their will more completely than they had ever imagined, not just removing financial support but requiring accountability that many had believed impossible to enforce. The act of disappearance had ultimately revealed her most essential self, not just a grandmother with assets to protect, but a formidable advocate with wisdom to share, a scholar with experience to analyze, a survivor with protection to create for others facing similar betrayal. As sleep approached, Eleanor reflected on William's favorite Hemingway quote about being strong in the broken places. The past year had proven its truth in unexpected ways. The fractures remained, family relationships permanently altered, trust irretrievably changed, assumptions forever challenged. But around and through those fractures, new strength had emerged, clarity of purpose, unwavering boundaries, authentic connections, and the determination to ensure that other elders would not face exploitation without recourse or support. On the winter solstice marking 1 year since her discovery of betrayal, Eleanor Blackwood fell asleep with the peaceful certainty that disappearing from her family's will had ultimately revealed her true worth, not as a source of financial support but as a powerful agent of transformation, whose legacy would extend far beyond bank accounts or property deeds to touch the lives of vulnerable elders she would never meet but whose protection she had helped ensure. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.